This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. So what is the maze that we want to avoid? Well, we want to avoid, walking into the wall every single day. I tend to do that a lot, usually when I first wake up in the morning, I think I know exactly what I'm going to do, how I'm going to feel. And then I walk into a dresser, I walk into my bedroom door, something happens and everything changes. Today, my guest is Doug Garland, and he has a message for us that I guess I'm very surprised I know nothing about. So that's why I'm excited to have him here. It's the tall poppy syndrome. Now, if all of you are out there listening and you say, well, I know everything about it, then I guess I must have been under a rug for quite a long time. So, Doug, welcome to Avoid the Maze. And tell me, how long has this syndrome been around that I have no idea what it meant?
Well, it's been around since the Bible. And if you
Wow.
understand the Bible, you'll see it almost in every passage. In the end, Moses was tall poppy, Eve was tall poppy. So when you get the concept, if you look at the Bible, you see it. And actually in the book I wrote, I used two examples, one from Cain and Abel, which was familial envy, and Cain killed Abel. So that's in Genesis. So right away it's described. And Joseph, of the 12 brothers, then Joseph, the guy with the fancy jacket, his brothers tall poppied him because he was favored by his father. So they tall poppied him when they sold him to Egypt. But the most fascinating aspect of that part is that he had a dream, and he dreamed he was a tall poppy. He called it a wheat field, and he grew taller than his brothers. So the actual description of the tall poppy was in Joseph in Genesis. But the original description came from Herodotus in ancient Greece. And most governments from that point on had that metaphor. But at that time, it was the rulers would lop off the heads, at that time was described as wheat, of the opposing people so that they could govern and wouldn't have opposition. So that was ancient Greece, it was described. And of course, one of our most famous people is Socrates. He was tall poppy. So he had ideas that the city council didn't like. And rather than fight with them, he actually willingly drank the hemlock to try and have peace and harmony within the city. And then Livy really described the metaphor as we know it today using the poppy. And he described the same thing of the rule of the king. It was in the kingdom of Rome, and that's 750 to 500 BC. And the son was having difficulty ruling the neighboring town, and his son sent an envoy back to his father on how to rule. And his father went out to a poppy field and lopped off the tall poppies. And so the son knew immediately what to do, and he killed all the leading opposition rulers of the town. So of course, Julius Caesar is one of my favorite tall poppies, and he obviously was tall poppy. And the metaphor immediately runs into some confusion, because some people would say that Brutus was the tall poppy because he got rid of Caesar. And in fact, Napoleon had this hall of statues of famous and inspirational people, and he had both Caesar and Brutus in it, which is also very fascinating. So that was description in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and it's been pervasive in society ever since. Almost all societies that I looked at from the beginning of ancient Greece to present day. And of course, the question was, why isn't it in America? Is it in America? What prevents it in America? But first, before we get too much further, we should describe just exactly what the metaphor means.
Sure.
Just looking at a poppy field and seeing one poppy taller than the rest and wanting to cut it down so that all are equal. And my feeling was that that was happening in America, especially with our cancel culture. So that was a big driver of my interest in the tall poppy syndrome.
So if I'm getting this correctly, the person who is considered the tall poppy in any group is one who basically has risen above with either knowledge or whatever, and the rest of the group doesn't want that person to thrive.
Correct. So that's the basic concept. And it's, it's a big part of governments throughout world history was described about governments. And then Australia, because it's an egalitarian country, and I mean that because of its original roots, it was a penal colony. And the country grew up with that cultural mentality that all people are equal. We're all equal here, but that's, as we know, is not completely true. So in that country, everybody is equal, and they maintain that equal status and try not to grow tall because you don't want to stick out. If you stick out, then somebody will cut you down to their
Right.
size. So all the not all, but the majority of psychosocial studies on the tall poppy syndrome are from Australia. One of the fascinating things about that is they studied mostly the cutter's behavior. So the cutter behavior is usually bad envy. Envy, beginning with Aristotle, was divided into good and bad. Good envy is me seeing you and you dress nicely and you have a nice car and you're smart. So I want to emulate you. So I do things to improve myself. Bad envy is most frequently found in low self-esteem people, and they perceive that they can't be like you. So they want to cut you down either actively, which would be keying your fancy car if you have one, but the more passive and most common way is to do it disparagingly. You talk about you, get to your neighbor and try and have them degrade you. So envy by far and away is the most common cause in the cutter. Anger also is part of it, a big part in revenge. And then to a certain extent, laziness, because some people just don't want to improve themselves. It's just easier
Sure.
to get somebody down. So the Australians describe the second main cutter in their group, which is justification. So the few tall poppies that they have in Australia get cut down. Why? Mostly because of pride, lust, and greed. So if you're into religion at all, I've just described 6 of the 7 deadly sins. The seventh sin that I didn't mention is gluttony. But Australia never talked about the bad behavior in the tall poppy to justify cutting them down. So that was a big part of my own research, was to also study tall poppies and why they are cut down. So Australia really doesn't have a lot of tall poppies, and so that was never part of their research. It wasn't, and the rest of the world actually doesn't have a lot of tall poppies. It is really in America that we have a large number of tall poppies. We have the entertainment industry, the sports industry, the business industry, the media industry like yourself. So we probably have more tall poppies than the rest of the world combined. So our culture is so different from the rest of the world. I felt that there was something different why we didn't have the syndrome here when I could identify it everywhere else. Another example would be, well, the Japanese are very egalitarian, and there's not much difference between what a CEO makes and what the online workers make. And their saying is the tall male gets pounded down. Now, Holland is a very egalitarian country. Their saying is the tall tree captures all the wind. And of course, the most fascinating area are the Nordic countries. And they have what they call the law of Jante, Jante, and it's actually 10 commandments that are in their culture of how not to grow tall. And so they really practice not sticking out in their society and that everybody's equal. And of course, that leads to some conclusions of why they're all so happy, because everybody's equal. My own research on those countries, I sort of felt that wasn't completely true. I think they actually have Danish envy, Swedish envy. It's very prevalent in their societies as well. From the prisoners, we know that, if one prisoner has a toothbrush and the other one doesn't, it drives them crazy. So just in the egalitarian society, if one person has a little bit more than the other person, that whole concept falls apart. So there's a hidden envy throughout the world that doesn't come to the surface until there's actually a cutting.
As I'm listening to this, it certainly makes a lot of sense. But if we know this, I don't understand why we aren't smart enough, because I think you and I are, so I think our listeners are. Why aren't we smart enough to see that if we work together rather than against each other, life would be so much better for all of us? But cutting that one person down or those 10 people down because they're taller, do we really gain anything by that? Because I don't think we do.
Well, that's the problem with our own country. I think our philosophy has changed, and whoever is driving what I consider madness. We used to be a country of abundance and wanting the American dream. And that was our goal, to have the chicken in the pot and
Right.
the 2-car garage and the green lawn, and that was in the reach of everybody. And we were a country, one of the only countries in the world with abundance and a big supply of energy, big supply of water, big supply of jobs, and the potential to move up. And that's slowly disappearing. And I think that in the end is what's driving it. But we can't get our act together to figure it out. So let me explain a little bit more about my observational research. So if you understand that envy is driving your bad behavior, and most of us don't, I usually use the concept of a bully who bullies in grade school, and he continues that behavior even if he becomes a CEO, such as Steve Jobs. And unless somebody calls him out, they really don't understand, has the power to call out the tall poppy. You can't really change that behavior. And of course, Steve Jobs himself was called out, and the board of Apple cutting down, and he lost his job. So he figured it out. In his second act, he was much better off and ran a much better company. So getting cut down is not necessarily bad, but if you even start in your own family, just like Cain and Abel, I came from a family of 7, and my parents tried very hard to make sure all of us grew up with all these same opportunities, and one wasn't favored. That was Joseph's problem. Joseph's father favored him, and it drove his brothers crazy.
Right.
So it starts in your household, but you don't know it. I didn't figure it out till I actually figured it out. I went to medical school. My mother had kept a log of how much money she spent on each of us for education and stuff. and I found that one day when I was home. For some reason, it was on the kitchen table, maybe on purpose, but she had everything of the major expenses and tried to equal everything out in our lives. And so you go into school, and the school, especially now, not so much. I'm 78. I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the space race era. And I'm telling you, it was competitive. The schools were competitive. They wanted you to get smart. They worked on getting you smart.
Right.
Now I think there's a lot of difference. The schools themselves try to keep everybody equal. The better students want to get out of that and go to the charter schools or homeschool. So education has changed, and then the job you get, so you have it in home, schooling, and then of course you get to our meritocracy workplace, and you got to crawl up the rung of success, crawl up the ladder and go from one rung to the next. So within the business field in America, we have competition, and competition breeds the tall poppy syndrome. So you have it in the workplace. And that was the first thing when I was personally tall poppy. My friend that I used to bounce ideas off of, he says, well, you can't be tall poppy. You're not a tall poppy. So I had to work through that. The metaphor is much more complex than the simple metaphor. And so I changed it into peer-to-peer. So with it, the prevalence of the tall poppy syndrome is within your own tribe, your
Okay.
family, your school, your home, your neighborhood, who you relate to. And you don't have to be tall, you just have to have envy. And then there's what I call the public tall poppy syndrome, which is what we see in the news, the true tall poppies through their egregious behavior driven by mainly lust, greed, and pride, mostly pride. Pride gets everybody into trouble. Those egregious behaviors then makes the public want to cut them down. So that's how in America I've divided it separately, which you won't see other countries talk about the actual behavior of the tall poppy itself. But if you understand those concepts of the peer-to-peer in the public, it really helps you. And the last big thing, we always prided ourselves on our government in American democracy. And I just found that I found our government as guilty as peer-to-peer as cutting other people down, either the politicians between the parties or individuals, and using the various departments to cut people down. So once I understood the metaphor, you can apply it to your life, your peer group, to your city, to your country, and to the world. I mean, if you look at Russia, I mean,
Right.
Putin is a prideful guy. He's got way too much pride, and he's cutting down a country. And Zelensky's a tall poppy and who is drifting towards freedom, free democracy, and NATO. And Putin felt he needed to cut him down to size.
Right.
So the whole metaphor has broad implications, and if you understand the metaphor, it really helps you understand life. Now, the final part of my research in the book, I wasn't writing a self-help book. The book was set up to be a self-help. About a third of the book was self-help, I had a chapter actually, how to become a tall poppy. There's 10,000 self-help books published annually.
Right.
And when I read that, I thought I have no business in the self-help book, because all these people are working specifically on that, and mine is kind of an afterthought. But if you read the book, it is a self-help book because you understand the behaviors of the people around you, and you get caught up in the madness too. So if you understand their behavior, especially if it's bad, you know how to act to it. And you also have to understand your own bias, because if you look at politics, your bias feeds greatly into that madness.
Sure.
And so you're just as bad as the egregious tall poppy in many cases. And I actually did have a book on my Hall of Fame tall poppies. And in order to be my tall poppy, you had to serve people. And if you served your fellow man, chances are you weren't going to get cut down by anybody, because everybody knows your good intentions.
You know, it's interesting because my family has been going through something that totally reflects this syndrome. My son has been moving up in his business development. He got a job out of state. He moved, put all of his energy into it. And once he got there, he saw that all the great things they said about hiring him, they just throw out the door the moment he walked in the door. And he tried very hard to like follow their flow. And after a week, he sat down with the person who hired him and he said, whoa, like, aren't I supposed to be doing this, this, and this? And the answer was, well, not anymore. And everything he would try to do, he even used the word, they're chopping my feet off every hour, every day. And he was trying to stick it out, really was. He wanted to believe that one day they were going to wake up and say, now we know why we really hired you. You are terrific. And strangely enough, today he walked in and he gave his notice. He said, I don't deserve what has happened. This is why you hired me. You didn't fulfill your agreement. And you know what? I'm tired of being cut down below the knees. I need to save the rest of my body. And he called and told me that. And I said, you are a much better person than I, because I worked in corporate America and I allowed them to keep cutting me down because I kept believing they were so much better than me. So we're all experiencing this to some degree or another.
Yes.
But are we just like sweeping it under the rug because we're afraid to do anything about it?
Well, naturally, there's always a yin and a yang. So I can just tell you that same thing happened to me. That when I was tall poppy, I had been away to a medical meeting and I'd come back and there was a note on my office door that my office had been moved from the big fancy office, corner office with the window, power office, down to a little cubby hole. And, you know, I couldn't figure out what that was all about. And I came home and told my wife, and she's kind of like you, looking, that's why I say if you read the book and understand the metaphor, you really grow. Because if you're out of the fight, my wife knew exactly what was happening. And she said, you know, you've been there 30 years. You're the people you grew in with, they've all retired and moving out. There's a new breed coming in and you're not part of that peer group now, and they want to get rid of you. And she said, I'll tell you what, just quit, just what he did. And I'll take Fridays off. You take Fridays off. We lived in LA, and we'll see LA and enjoy LA instead of on the weekends when everybody else wants to see LA. And so the next day, I just did what your brother did. I flipped the switch. I put my key on my desk. I had all my research, all these plaques and everything. I brought in 2 big garbage cans and threw everything in the garbage cans, put the key on the desk and walked out. Now, I didn't have the emotional intelligence at that time to understand exactly what had happened, but my wife did. And so if it hadn't been for her, I would have gotten in a pissing contest
Right.
and gotten in a fight with them and my pride would have gotten the best of me. And I may well have been able to fight my way back and get my office and keep my position. But trust me, it would have never been the same. It's just like Boris Johnson in England now, they
Right.
just, he won his battle, but he essentially is cut down and everything's going to be very different going forward.
Right.
So my
Exactly.
wife had the emotional intelligence at that time that I didn't have. But you're right, unless you do have that or somebody else, an unbiased observer looking at it can kind of help you grow. But yeah, I'm telling you, you're going to see it everywhere now once you know the syndrome, and your listeners will too. It's just, I think it's worse in America. I thought the end of our worship of the individual prevented it, but I actually think our individualism makes it worse because of the competition. We're a competitive society.
And, we teach that right from the time our kids start preschool all the way through. My son, who I was referring to, at age 6, he was identified being on the autism spectrum. And I went to his doctor and I said, wait a second, he doesn't have certain tendencies and he does this, and this. He's been on time. He said, no, he's on the spectrum. And okay, fine. You want to say that? Well, once it was identified and his teachers knew, then all of his classmates knew, and they looked at him differently. And one of the things I saw happening to him, my son, he likes competition, but he knows when it's right to compete for himself and when it's not. And I cannot tell you how many times I would get a call from the school saying, your son didn't stand up for himself today. And I said, and what did he have to stand up for? Well, somebody grabbed his lunch. I said, well, maybe he didn't like his lunch. Maybe he didn't care about it. I said, what did you want him to do? Did you want him to have a meltdown? Did you want him to hit the kid? Did you want him to go rat on the kid? What? And they said, this is a competitive world, and we teach that in every class. So I sat in on a class. I think he was like 2nd or 3rd grade. And there was an award, even if it was just a piece of paper, given out every time a student raised their hand and gave the right answer. And I thought, that's not the world. But actually, as you and I are talking, that is our world. We are praising people for being at the top this minute and then cutting them down because, we can't reach that level, or we don't think we can.
No, you're right. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm a physician, and I went through the space race in beginning, I think, around junior high, and so it became very competitive. We had to beat Russia, and so America was on this steroids of higher education. So that feeling was in the school, but then, of course, in high school, then you had to get good grades to get into college. And then I had to get good grades to get into medical school. And then I had to get into my residency. And then I had to get into a good practice. And then I had to build my practice. So and then I was also in academics. I was a full clinical professor of orthopedics at USC. So you have that publish or perish. So I had to publish. And so my whole life was really built around competition. And, I think that's a big part of what burnout is right now, that the fire in the belly is not necessarily there when society wants it there. And so they're feeling they don't want to compete and just enjoy life. And so I think that's a big part of our burnout, especially in medicine. But anyway, yeah, I mean, it just was pervasive in America. But I mean, I think that's when we compare to Sweden and the Nordic countries, they don't have that competition. And of course, if you don't succeed, then you feel you're a failure and you're not happy, where they don't have that kind of pressure. So I think that's one of the big differences in our culture and why they're supposed to be the happiest people in the world. And we're some of the most unhappy people in the world. And it's because of our lack of perceived success.
Well, I have to say that in the last year and a half since I've been doing Avoid the Maze, I've been interviewing individuals like yourself, personal coaches, because I've realized that we keep waiting for everybody else around us to make us happy. And we have to start from within. And, you know, I've never really been a competitive person. Probably for the first 50 years of my life, I thought everybody else was much better than me. And why? Because, you know, if I was in an actual running foot race, I was typically the slowest. So I wasn't as good as the person who won. And most of the time I didn't finish across the finish line because, hey, I'm last anyways. What does it matter? But I started to learn right around my 50th birthday. You finish for yourself. You do it for you. You know, you do the best you can today. And that has made a whole difference in my life in looking at people around me. You know, my husband has been through numerous job changes in the 38 years we've been together. And we have a friend who looks at that as he's a failure. I look at it and I say, as long as he's working at being his best, and he is, and he's good to other people, and he wakes up in the morning with a smile on his face, that's what life is about. And yes, has he gotten cut down like the tall poppy? Absolutely has. But you know what? You have to find that inner strength. And that's what it sounds like you did when you found out, hey, they're pushing me down to this little office. This is not what I want. Your wife could see it and help you and guide you through it. And then it was, you know what? I don't have to do this for other people. What am I going to do for myself?
No, that was exactly what happened. And I mean, I was in the competitive business of publishing, perishing. I was actually an Australian. I was to go to Australia to, I was president of the American Spinal Injury Association at that time. I was to go to Australia to review. They had 6 rehabilitation centers, and to review those, 6 a week at each one. And I called them up and said I wasn't going, and because of my wife, and I threw all my slides and all my talks and everything away to make sure that I couldn't renege on it and get back into the hamster cage.
Right.
And I told them I wasn't coming. And they wanted to know why. And they said, well, you've been tall poppy. So that was my actual introduction from Australia itself. And of course, I would go on to spend the next 10 years before I retired and had time to research it, wondering about it, and kind of already looking at the world differently and trying to figure out what happened. But the best thing was I got out of that competition, and I had a big private practice as well, and just did a private practice. But I got out of that academic push and just enjoyed taking care of people. And that's how I more came up with kind of the same thing you're talking about. You have to serve yourself first, and you have to be comfortable who you are. It doesn't matter what you're doing, but just do a good job. And that was, as I say, the easiest thing also is to serve people. So, I mean, if you're a male person, it's very easy to have satisfaction in that job, because if you do a really good job delivering the mail, you're going to be really, really happy because you're a good mail person. And I mean, my mail person's really good. They see something in the mail important, they actually knock on the door. So
how wonderful. Yeah.
Right. So, right. How wonderful is that? So they actually give you personal service. And of course, I was serving fellow man as a physician, but being a physician is hard work if you're a good physician. So I never enjoyed it because I'm a light sleeper and I couldn't enjoy my work because I was always worried. But when I actually cut down on my workload and quit my research and my extra job of running the spinal cord injury unit, then I enjoyed my practice much more and served mankind much better, I felt, and myself and my wife and my family. So it was a big win.
I don't know what's happening on the West Coast, but speaking of physicians, one of the things that we're noticing is that there are some of our physicians that we've had for 10, 15, maybe 20 years, okay, who they weren't ready to retire, but the hospitals now are pushing them out for the younger core. They don't want them spending extra time with their patients, which is something that I grew up with in the 50s and 60s myself. Okay. Your doctor didn't just walk in for 5 minutes and then walk out. They knew you. Okay. They knew what your test results meant. But here in Ohio, especially, so many of our doctors are retiring much earlier than they planned because the pressures that the hospitals are putting on them. And, hallelujah to you that you did what you needed to do for yourself, not because, maybe you were pushed out, but it made you become aware. And I think that's what we all have to do. I don't care if somebody's working in McDonald's or if somebody is shoveling snow, raking leaves, whatever that is, we have to feel pride in what we do. And, I tried for a long time. And when I left corporate America, the first podcast I did, having no idea what I was doing other than having a degree in communications, I sat before the mic, watching the soundboard that somebody else was taking care of. And I felt pride in what I was doing. And I knew I was helping the person that I was talking to because they had a message and I wanted to make sure their message came across well. And it's been like that, for the last 10 years.
Well, but you're discovering it with me as well. As I mentioned, pride is I grew up as a strict Catholic, and that's where the 7 deadly sins came from, was from a Pope. And strangely enough, those 7 deadly sins were how the monks wouldn't get into trouble. And I'm thinking, how do they need these rules when they're in a cloister, and not around any people? But once again, it's that peer-to-peer and everybody's the same. And that sameness is very hard on people. If somebody has just a little extra ice cream that you don't get or something, it drives people crazy. But anyway, in Catholicism, you have the sin, the bad emotion, and then you have a virtue. So you have the corresponding thing. So the psychologists look at the 7 deadly sins, for example. So envy, good and bad envy. Good is emulation. And so pride is the same way. There's good pride and bad pride. And the good pride really is just what you're describing. And that's what you need to, every listener needs to think about. Pride of ownership. There's a really good pride that makes you a good person if you just take pride in who you are and what you're doing, as opposed to the bad pride, which is what gets us in trouble when we do get cut down or we're doing bad behavior. And it's the most common cause of the egregious being cut down is pride. And I have to tell you, you probably haven't heard the story of the psychiatrist walking into the room and there's a guy laying on the couch and he says, what's your problem? You got daddy issues or you got pride issues? Probably both of them, but that pretty much drives the male madness, I call it. And it could have easily captured me, but my wife rescued me. And I mean, it was a completely different path that I was able to take. And otherwise, I could have put on the boxing gloves and started fighting and dug in and had a few more years of maintaining my position, but not being happy about it.
Well, and I hear you well, because in the beginning, when my son started noticing these things, he would call home, and we're his sounding board. We always have been, and he was, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I finally just let him talk. And I said, and is that what you want to do? He goes, no, but there's this little voice in my head. He says, I got to get it out, because if I don't, I'm going to go in tomorrow and I'm going to say the things I shouldn't say. And those are some of the things that I've learned also in the last 10 years of my life, is that we all need to vent. We need to vent in the proper way. And we need to take those noises in our head and be able to say, okay, what is good for me? What isn't? And it sounds like your wife is very perceptive. She saw what was happening. And I'm sure she didn't tell you what to do, but she guided you in the way that made sense for you.
No, she told me what to do.
Oh,
I mean, I
okay.
would, no, she told me, you need to resign. I'll take Friday. She's a nurse. And she said, I'll take Fridays off. Don't go into your off, take that day off that you're going to the rehab hospital, and take that day off, and I'll take a day off, and we'll take Friday, then we'll put it Friday and we'll enjoy LA. So
Wonderful.
I would have never figured that out by myself. So
Okay.
I was very, very lucky.
Absolutely.
And-
Well, how
and
can our listeners find your book? Because you know what, I think it's important, and I'm hoping that I will get a little bit smarter once I read it.
So it's on Amazon. It's The Tall Poppy Syndrome, The Joy of Cutting Others Down. I have a website, Doug Garland, DOUGGARLAND.com. And on that is a lot of information about the tall poppy syndrome. On the top right, there's articles. I introduced it into the medical literature. And so there's articles that I published on the tall poppy syndrome in medicine, and it's rampant in medicine. It's rampant in all professions because of competition. And that is Medium, which is Google's blog space, which I blogged for a while. And then tweeting. I tweet every day. So actually, I was going to mention this. I tweet every day. When I started this is called an observational study. I published over, I forget how many articles now, but quite a few articles, scientific articles, when I was a physician. And that's doing the scientific method. And the observational study is like going to Africa and observing apes. So I observed the apes in America. So I took the LA Times, the New York Times, Time Magazine. And so for 10 years, I just observed America. And I thought, holy moly, every day I found examples of the tall poppy syndrome. And so here I was thinking that we don't have the tall poppy syndrome in America. And every day I was observing examples of the tall poppy syndrome. So that's actually how I made all these things up that I've done. How I did it was called an observational study.
Sure.
So I'm still good. If you look at my website, you'll see all that happening, and even the tweets. I tweet every day. I still look at journals every day. The only problem with that is, if I tweet a Wall Street Journal article, if you don't take the Wall Street Journal, then sometimes you can't open it.
Right.
But there's rarely a day, if you want to get into my head, I tweet, and I just tweet out, this is an example of the tall poppy syndrome, and I tell you why that I think that's what it is, and
Okay.
why it is, and whose bad behavior it is, whether it's the cutter or the cuttee. And remember, you're part of it too. So you're growing as well by doing that. But anyway, the book is available on Amazon. And the other thing you actually do, one of my goals, if you have just another minute,
Sure.
when I was a stinker on the internet because I did a lot of research in my profession, and I felt there was so much bad information on the internet. So part of my madness was to do good research and get on the internet. So if you Google the tall poppy syndrome, then my book will actually come up because the cover of the book is very beautiful. So a photograph of the cover comes up, then my website comes up, and the book itself comes up, and it's all on the first page. So of course, if people understand Google, that's what you actually look for, is to be on that front page. So if you want to get to me, just Google the tall poppy syndrome. And if you want to see some interesting articles, because the articles that I wrote about doctors are very instructive as well. You can just do Google the tall poppy syndrome in medicine. And those articles that I wrote about physicians cutting each other down are very fascinating because they're true. It's peer-to-peer on one hand, but it's true some of the people in medicine are true tall poppies. So to see those people get cut down is a mind blower.
I'm sure it
So
is.
those are some good ways to help wrap your arms around the tall poppy syndrome.
Well, Dr. Doug Garland, we are so glad that we had you on today. To all of our listeners, please follow Dr. Doug, because I think the better educated we are about what is happening around us is only going to make us stronger and better. And I have to agree with you. Growing up in the 50s and 60s, we were a great melting pot with lots and lots of future options. And today, I think we still have them, but we are not working towards them. And, for the generations to come, we got to keep America strong. So,
We're fighting against each other. There's plenty of room for everybody in America.
absolutely.
There's still the American dream. It is a little harder. I get it. I mean, colleges cost a lot more now. There's more competition. I mean, the abundance wasn't as great as it was when we came through, but it's still out there.
You
And you
got
don't
it.
have to cut other people down to get it. Just take care of number one. That's you.
Perfect. Perfectly said. Well, have a great day. Enjoy a beautiful weekend. And for all of you, even if it's not sunny out right now, it's above the clouds. So have a good day. Bye-bye now.